welcome to Season 11, Episode 7 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading J.R.R. Tolkien's The Monsters and the Critics and other essays, this time on the penultimate essay, A Secret Vice, which I think we talked about that last season. That doesn't mean...
The final.
Yes, that is the one before the last. It doesn't mean like the very, very last. The pen is not qualifying ultimate in that way. It's like the one before the ultimate.
Yeah, I always thought before this podcast,
Yes.
Penultimate, the big final one.
No, not quite. Actually, well, I guess not the exact opposite. I guess the exact opposite would be the first one.
Yes.
But a very different meaning.
Yes. We saw the ultimate Mission Impossible.
Hopefully, the ultimate Mission Impossible.
That movie was ridiculous.
It was absolutely absurd.
It was a well-produced spectacle of nonsense and illogical actions.
It was just Tom Cruise fest. That's all it was just a big Tom Cruise fest.
Yeah. It did show him running a lot.
Yes.
Which actually, he's 62. He runs pretty
That's true.
fast.
I mean, it's kind of impressive that he does the things he does,
Yes,
but it's
100%.
absolutely ridiculous,
Yeah.
the whole movie.
Yes. Anyway, that was not the penultimate. Hopefully
Hopefully that was...
You can retire that.
It was the 8th one. That's ridiculous.
Yes.
But what do you think about this essay talking about Tolkien making up languages?
A lot of it I liked.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it I was like, okay, this is really specific to linguists.
Right.
And I think that summarizes. What did you think? Did you like it by any chance?
No, I think I did. But no, this is definitely one of the most like autobiographical things like he ever presented publicly.
Oh,
like he never really wrote a biography or anything like that. There's like some more directly autobiographical stuff like in his letters, but those were always private until they were published, after his death.
Right.
And so this is like one of the few times where we see him like specifically talking about himself.
Yeah.
And he kind of addresses that like in the essay, because the essay is all about like how he likes to invent languages, and he says that's why it's a secret vice, right? Nobody does this.
Yes.
This is kind of a weird thing that I do, but actually it might not really be that weird. Maybe other people have this like love of language, like just as an art form, but they don't like express it because nobody else like talks about this publicly.
Yes.
So he was one of the first to really kind of address this.
It is weird.
It is weird.
It is
to be sure.
unusual, I
Yes,
should at least
yes.
say. I mean, to create your own language, it just seems like such an absurd thing to do.
Yes. Well, now it's kind of become like a thing. I mean, at least among linguists. But you'll meet quite a few people in linguistics departments who are like, oh yeah, I've made up 5 of my own languages, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. But I mean, there's even like constructed languages like college courses, where you talk about like how you construct languages and things like that. And there've been other uses for constructed languages. Like he starts off by talking about Esperanto in here.
Yes.
So
Is
rather
Esperanto still a thing?
yes, kind of.
Because I think they were trying to make it a thing when I was a kid, I think, which would have been like the 70s, early 80s.
It doesn't have nearly as much like support as I think it did. I mean, even back in the 70s and 80s, but it was really sort of popular like early 1900s. Into the mid-century there.
Yeah.
Because it was like, this sort of...
Common tongue.
yes.
of
And I
Europe.
think there was like another revival of it, after World War II.
Yeah.
Where it's like, well, we need something to really unify all of Europe and things like that. And sort of in those sorts of movements, it was like, we need everything to bring everybody together, this common language. Yeah. But the problem with it is it's completely artificial.
Right. Right.
In the essay, this is really interesting. I know you don't read the end notes.
I did not.
You did not, but there was one that was really interesting because he starts off by praising Esperanto. He says, there was an Esperanto Congress, here at Oxford, and I think that's a really great, interesting project. But then there's a footnote here from Christopher Tolkien, who edited this volume, at least in part, and he says... In what was either a draft for the opening passage of this essay or more probably a draft for its rewriting, my father wrote that he was no longer so sure that an artificial language would be a good thing, and said that at present I think we should be likely to get an inhumane language without any cooks at all, their place being taken by nutrition experts and dehydrators. Because he uses this analogy starting off this essay. It's like, well, if you only have one cook creating a language, it's like a much more streamlined thing than if you have a whole bunch of cooks over 2,000 years. But now he's kind of realizing, later on when he's rewriting the essay, well, actually, you get something that's just not very human at all.
Right.
It's this very artificial, contrived process. So I thought that was really interesting to see, in that end note there, how he kind of changed his mind later on, which I think is a good change of mind in that regard.
Yeah, I would think so. It's kind of like if you what do you call that? Where you put it up on the web so everybody can edit things. What do you call it? A group? There's a term for it.
group sharing.
You try to problem solve by everybody
Crowdsourcing.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you. I knew there's a term for it. And that's kind of like what language is, really, is it crowdsourcing for communications, just generally.
Right.
Because we're animals that use language.
Yes, that is true.
To communicate.
Yes. Good point.
I have deep thoughts.
Do you? What are your thoughts on Esperanto? I don't know if you have any.
I don't know that I had any. I'd forgotten about it until he mentioned it in this. It always struck me as an artificial, it kind of like something that would be foisted upon us by big, kind of like the metric system. Oh, but it makes more sense. I don't care. Right. A mile is a mile, and I don't care how many kilometers are in it. That's European talk.
Sure.
And I want to measure things in pounds and ounces and yards and that kind of stuff. Right. And so I always viewed it as that kind of effort to streamline everything and to dehumanize it.
It's really accurate.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, I have a story about Esperanto. Have I told you the story about Esperanto?
You've never told me an Esperanto story.
I think I have told you the story. Maybe it's not public information. Maybe I'm revealing some secrets here. But like a year ago, I met Michael Knowles, the conservative commentator. And he was telling me he used to be an actor. That was like the first part of his career. And he once auditioned for a role. And he didn't really know what he was auditioning for, but he was talking to people, and they're like, "Do you speak any other languages?" And he's like, "Yeah, I can do a little bit of Italian or Spanish." And kind of as a joke, he says, "Yeah, and I can also speak a little bit of Esperanto." And the person says, "Oh, that's great. We were actually looking for someone who might have experience with Esperanto." Like, well, what are you talking about? Turns out what he was auditioning for was a party for George Soros, where he was like having some sort of play put on at his party, and because George Soros was raised,
you did tell me this.
I did tell you the story. He was raised as one of his languages was Esperanto, where his parents tried to teach it to him. Where it's like, I think that's exactly what it is. That weird sort of like globalist figures.
Yes,
I kind of love this idea of Esperanto, but nobody else really likes it, and it seems very inhumane.
Yeah,
so that's my Esperanto story.
You have told me that. It's a good story. Yeah, I don't know that it was told in confidence.
I guess not. No. I suppose not.
Well, now it's out there in the world.
Yes, for all 5,000 of our daily listeners.
That many? You think it's that many? I think it might be by a factor of 10 lower. Anywho, 100. No. Anywho, I did have some. There were some. He told this story that I didn't quite understand. He says, "I shall never forget a little man, smarter than myself." That thing,
Yes. So he's talking about.
He was, and he says, this guy, he suddenly, in a dreamy voice, said, "Yes, I think I shall express the accusative case by a prefix."
So he's telling the story where he's like in some wet, muddy tent in the army, and he has this small guy next to him. He says, kind of daydreaming. He says, "Yes, I think I shall express the accusative case by a prefix." And so he realizes this guy next to him is making up his own language, right? It's not that, the accusative case in this language is expressed. It's like not he realized how something in another language worked, but it's like, I want to express the accusative case by a prefix.
That makes sense.
And so he realizes that there's somebody other than him in the whole world who has done this weird thing that he does as a hobby.
Okay, because does it during the war?
Yes, during the war,
because he mentions...
he says we were listening to somebody lecturing on map reading or camp hygiene or the art of sticking a fellow through without bothering who God sent the bill to. He gives this whole long-winded, very Tolkienian description of army life there.
Yeah, I thought this was really poignant. He says, how far he ever proceeded in his composition, I never heard. Probably he was blown to bits in the very moment of deciding upon some ravishing method of indicating the subjunctive.
Yeah.
Wars are not favorable to delicate pleasures. I just thought that was really profound statement, almost an absurd statement, like this, talking about this guy creating a language. It would have been trench warfare in World War One.
Yeah.
It was just a meat grinder.
Yeah.
So that struck me as he's just a really talented writer.
Oh yeah.
I mean, just that he tells that little aside of how this is a strange little, happened to run into somebody that had a very similar interest, but didn't share it really. He just heard this guy say this thing. And then he's able to describe it in such a way you'd really feel it, and you can feel that he has like a sense of fatalism almost, but also sadness maybe. But he doesn't beat you over the head with it. But it's almost a little dismissive too. Like, oh well, wars are not favorable to delicate pleasures, which is a really poignant and powerful way of communicating, the destruction of war.
Yeah. Well, he had two of his very close, childhood friends die in World War One. There was this group of four of them who, were kind of a predecessor to, the later Inklings group in a way, where they were all, very interested in the arts and things like that and wanted to really just put their poetry and writing out there in the world. And then two of them die. Yeah. Right? And so he's kind of seeing, I think, the same thing that happened to his own friends, with this guy, where it's this is a guy who's very similar to me. Yeah. Maybe he no longer is alive. And you see that a lot with those authors who fought in World War One. There was actually a big explosion of literature after World War One. A lot of those people who fought in World War One, what it is about the war that made them, write these beautiful things. But a lot of them had that same sort of attitude that the sort of fleetingness of everything.
Yeah, I have a theory. I have a theory about most things, whether it's true or not. I have a theory that so many of the men that fought in that war were so idealistic before the war, patriotic idealism, and were so many of them were so well read and intelligent, and then the delusionment that happens with that senseless strategy and tactics, and really thoughtlessness and really depravity on the part of the generals and the leadership of just sending people to their doom without a second thought. I think that combination of those three things, the one, that they were so idealistic, two, that they knew history and they knew the arts, and then three, getting put in that meat grinder for no particular purpose and realizing the futility of it. And then you question God, you question everything. I mean, it must have been such a shock to them. Obviously war is going to be a shock to every soldier, but I think that generation in particular, because it's after the more romantic set piece wars, where you have these procedures and pageantry and this was a whole different industrialized killing. Anyway, I have theories.
No, I think you're probably right in that part. But then he goes on, he says, well, how do we talk about these things? There's not a lot of data that I can use because nobody's, public about these things. If there are people who are like me, he says, well, I'm just going to tell you about my own experiences, about how people, want to create languages of their own. And he says the first is this language called Animalic, which was actually developed by two other people that he knew. I think they ended up, they were cousins of his, who created this language that was really more or less a code for English. And he says, you see children sort of do this sort of thing, right? This isn't just me and my family here, where you have people who want to talk in some sort of secret code, and it's sort of like that. But there is some element of language there, right? It's not just replacing English words with other words you come up with or things like that. But there's something about it where kids find it fun to play with sounds and things like that. There's some sort of beauty there. There's some sort of art that they see there that isn't just trying to avoid, adults and sort of disguise their speech. There's something a little bit more to it than that, although this language didn't really progress anywhere further than much of a basic code.
Well, I don't know, what page does he start on that?
That was the bottom of 200.
Oh, okay, so I'm ahead of you.
Well, go ahead.
So he mentions on 202, he's talking about, the linguistic faculty. And he mentions, I thought that was really, and again, another poignant statement about language and all that. He says, an art for which life is not long enough, describing, study or love of language. Indeed, the construction of imaginary languages in full or outline for amusement, for the pleasure of the constructor, or even conceivably of any critic that might occur. I mean, it's just, it makes me appreciate his love of it, even though I have really no use for it. Yeah. Which is, I guess, shows his talent as a writer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And how passionate he was for something that I can understand his passion if I don't share it.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean that it was a lifelong project for him. We have like writings from just up to a couple years before his death, where he was like trying to figure out, still working on the language, not even just like his Lord of the Rings related stuff, not just like on the stories of the Silmarillion, but still just wanting to perfect the languages that he'd been working on for 50 years or something like that. It's pretty incredible.
Kind of an odd hobby.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Really cerebral. It's almost like a mathematician just working on just general math problems, but problems that you'd never solve or necessarily want to solve. I guess you're just perfecting them in some way.
Right.
It's wild. Yeah.
But then he goes on. He says, past this animalic language, you do have some other people who want to do more complicated things, and he created this. He says it's an idiom called Nevbosh, or the new nonsense.
Yeah, I didn't understand what he's talking about there. So maybe he can explain what he's doing there. And then there's another term later. Is that like another one in the...
Yes. So he's just describing successive languages that he made as he got older. Okay. So after, he had this language with his cousins that was more or less a code, then you start to see these linguistic, faculties, he calls them. They start to develop more and more, and you have more of an awareness of what a language is and what it can be outside of just English.
Okay.
So he's describing this one. So this is when he's, started to learn Latin. He says, because games cannot take up all one's time with Latin and mathematics and such things forced upon one's notice, but it was good enough for letters and even bursts of doggerel song. So you see, even making songs in this Nevbosh language.
What page are you on?
203.
Okay. All right.
Yes. And he gives this passage here that was in this Nevbosh language.
Yes.
And he says, one of the points I see is this: what happens when people try to invent new words, groups of sounds, to represent familiar notions? Whether the notion becomes in any way affected or not, we will leave aside. It is negligible at any rate in a case like Nevbosh, which is entirely dominated by an established natural idiom. This invention is probably always going on to the distraction of etymology, which more or less assumes, or used to assume, creation once for all in a distant past. And he says, really, with this Nevbosh language, it's still mimicking the English structure, but you're still just trying to make up new words, but you have a better understanding of how other languages sort of do different things.
Yes.
And he kind of gives these descriptions of where these other words are coming from. He says, I have this word, roque, which is from rogo in Latin, meaning ask, go from ego, meaning I, veil from French, vieux, meaning old, gome from homo in Latin, meaning man. He gives this whole list where he's like, which you don't seem as interested in.
I was not interested in that. I mean, I was not interested in it at all. I read it.
Well, that's good at least. I'm glad you didn't just skip it.
But it got pretty technical,
right?
And I'm sure it was of interest to you, I guess. So is it interest to you? As obviously anything Tolkien writes is interest to a linguist.
Yes.
But his descriptions there. I mean, are you interested?
I think that's very interesting because it shows how aware of what what a language can be. Because he's still not making things like from scratch. Right, he's still not using like new sounds that aren't in English. He's still using sounds that are in English. He's not using sounds from other languages, but he is starting to look at other languages for like sources of words. So like even the words he's using are derived from Latin or French or some from English. But he makes this particular note about this iskili, which is his word for possibly in Nevbosh. He says, who can analyze it? So this is like the first example that he has where it really is this entirely new word. Right, there's not really a word in any other language from possibly. He also mentions this word leant, quick, clever, or nimble, and he even derives other words from it. And so it's not just that you're coming up with a word to replace the English word with, but you're starting to make new things and then making new words based on other new words. And so it becomes increasingly complex and increasingly more like an actual language, sort of as you grow up and as you sort of learn how language works.
Yeah. Well, I would, and I get what his interest in is. It's odd, but I really like this quote on 206 where he talks about why he likes it so much. He says, this idea of using the linguistic faculty for amusement is, however, deeply interesting to me, which I think might be an understatement. I may be like an opium smoker seeking a moral or medical or artistic defense for his habit. I don't think so. The instinct for linguistic invention, the fitting of notion to oral symbol, and he has emphasized here, italicized, pleasure in contemplating the new relation established is rational and not perverted. But it's almost like he protests too much a little bit. He's just so into it.
Right.
But but he expresses it again in such a way as I understand why he likes it.
Right, because this is nobody.
Because otherwise, you try to talk to a man on the street about, hey, I think it's just a really beautiful artistic endeavor to create a new language that no one will ever speak, and I may not share with anybody.
Right.
And they're like, you're an idiot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's especially stranger going back to his time frame when this just wasn't a thing at all. Because now you have all of the fantasy authors want to be like J.R.R. Tolkien. They all make their own languages. So you have like all of the Game of Thrones stuff. And even Star Trek does this.
Oh, yeah, Klingon.
That's one of the big ones for all the constructed language nerds out there. Is they learn like the Elvish from Tolkien, and then they learn Klingon from Star Trek, and they like talk in it. And it's like a fully formed language you can speak in, both of them.
Yeah. Well, and I like the concept of Klingon because it was like a harsh, warlike race of people, or peoples, I guess it's just a race of people, of a people, and they had a very harsh sounding language, which I thought was really entertaining.
And he touches on that, like how languages sound. This is at the bottom of 206. It says, even seen darkly through the distorting glass of our ignorance of the details of Greek pronunciation, our appreciation of the splendor of Homeric Greek and word form is possibly keener or more conscious than it was to a Greek, much else of other elements of poetry that we may miss. He says, like, yeah, I mean, us as English speakers, we don't often, or maybe not as often, think about like how our language sounds to someone who's not as familiar with it. But if you like look at Homeric Greek, it's like, oh, that's a really beautiful language. And he's saying this is sort of that feeling, but to the utmost level, because this is a language that nobody speaks, and you're starting from scratch, purely for that aesthetic pleasure, really, in a way, that it's just sort of elevated because you can just make it as beautiful as you want it to be, and that's really when it becomes like an art form.
Yes. Yeah, and he mentions, he says, I love this in 207, he says, he's talking about people that are really into it. He says, most of the addicts reach their maximum of linguistic playfulness, and their interest is swamped by greater ones they take to poetry or prose or painting, or else it is overwhelmed by mere pastimes, cricket, Mekano, whatever that is, or such like foodle, or I really like this, or crushed by cares and tasks. And boy, isn't that the truth? Yeah. I mean, well, you'll realize this as you're older. Many of your dreams, your real idealistic dreams, can be and maybe will be crushed by cares and tasks. Yeah, it's not like some negative force in the world that's going to keep you from your artistic endeavors. It's you prioritize other things, and you just do your regular cares and tasks and daily chores. And you find, I haven't looked at that in 10 years. And you never go back.
Right. And I like what he says.
It's something to be careful of in your youth. Yeah. You got to keep that youthful enthusiasm for whatever your artistic endeavors are.
But he does say immediately after that, he says, a few go on, but they become shy, ashamed of spending the precious commodity of time for their private pleasure, and higher developments are locked in secret places. Yeah. And he's oddly prescient. He says, it can earn no prizes, win no competitions as yet, he says in parentheses, which there are actual fictional language competitions now where you can win money for like having the best created language. Which I've never participated in.
I was about to ask. It sounds like something that you would do.
No.
But I don't know you have enough time.
But then he goes on, he talks about another language that he has here, Napharin, this next stage of a language that he creates. And he says that now you really have more fully... he says it's not a representation of English, right? Yeah. It's not simply a code. You're not just sort of swapping out English words, but you're trying to construct your own grammar entirely.
So is this Napharim? This is something he's created?
Yes, all of these languages.
Are these? I didn't quite understand, maybe because I wasn't paying attention, but are these separate from each other, or is
these are separate? Yeah.
Are these stages in the development?
These are separate languages.
Completely separate. Okay, so it wasn't like he had one and then he kind of splintered the other one off. Right. This is okay.
Well, right, but with the last couple languages, that becomes an interesting point there with how they're related and stuff like that. But he gives this example of Napharin. He's saying that it's what.
No, it's just such a weird concept that he has his own personal language, and he's named it.
Right, yeah.
And
well, he goes even farther than just naming it, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
But he says, NAFR and the influences outside English and beyond a nascent, purely individual element are Latin and Spanish, and sound choices and combinations in general word form. And he goes on to talk about that a little bit more. He says it's a very much sort of a Romance language. I was really interested in the Romance languages, and that sort of came out. So it's branching beyond just English, looking at how other languages do things, and sort of just doing those in your own language. But again, for that pleasure,
I forget.
Like
was this a lecture? Or was this just an essay?
This was a lecture. So
okay.
this was given.
Yes. I read it as if it was a lecture.
Yes. This one was said to an audience. Yes, the audience was a philological society.
Yes, that's right. Okay.
Yes, right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But then he keeps going. He talks about, we keep getting more and more complicated. And then he says, this is on 212. He says, the time has come now, unless you had some other points you wanted to make on the pages before that.
No, go ahead.
Okay. But he says, the time has come now, I suppose, when I can no longer postpone the shamefaced revelation of specimens of my own more considered effort, the best I have done in limited leisure or by occasional thefts of time in one direction. The beautiful phonologies thrown away or moldering in drawers, arduous if pleasant in construction, the source of what little I know in the matter of phonetic construction based on my own individual predilections, will not interest you. I will offer some pieces of verse in the one language which has been expressly designed to give play to my own most normal phonetic taste. And he goes on and talks about that. And this is an example of one of the Elvish languages that he created. So this is, and he gives a couple different versions of this poem. So he has, it's titled Oilima Markiria. And I won't read the poem here, but he gives a translation there in English as well. Yes. And then he also gives, or maybe this is all, I believe, in one language here. He gives a couple different poems. But, he starts talking, okay, this is something that I have developed really entirely from scratch, right? Yeah. It takes influence from a lot of different languages, but this is sort of the pinnacle of like fictional language creation, right? It's not a code anymore. It's become its own thing. It has its own grammar structure that I'm not just pulling pieces from other languages. Like it is its own thing in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, what kind of lunatic or truly creative artist not only creates your own language, but then writes poetry in it, and they can translate it. And the translation is beautiful. Yeah, it's wild. Yeah. And I'm going to mention we're not going to mention the group we're at, but this weekend we're with this group, and it was like a discussion group. And we had one of the members, they had never done this before, read poems, selected poems. And then we discuss the meaning and that kind of stuff. And I don't think I made a single comment, which is good because, but it was really touching. And I don't know that I've ever listened to anyone read a poem before.
Yeah.
In my life, maybe in high school, because like sometimes like I vaguely recall different selected readings in high school. So we might have done it once or twice in high school, but it was really kind of a neat, unexpected. Because when they first started, I was like, "What the hell is happening?" They're going to have him read, and it was read by a really an interesting character, and not somebody that you would normally think would have a melodious voice.
But he did. He very slowly, very carefully. Yes, it was very beautiful.
It was actually touching. So now I'm into poetry.
Well, there you
go. I don't know where the hell that came from.
Well, then maybe it's worth just reading one paragraph of the language here, because I mean we've talked about his fictional languages.
Okay, so you're going to read it in the language or the translation?
I'll read it in the language.
Or which one are you going to read?
Just the first paragraph of that first one.
Okay.
Oilima Markiria. This man kiluva kiria ninque, oilima ailanello lute, nive kimari ringa ambar ve maiwin quaine. And he goes on and on. He has this whole long description, but I mean, you can hear. I mean, that's like a pretty beautiful thing to write down, assuming I'm pronouncing it correctly.
So the translation is the last arc, right?
Yes.
So read that.
Who shall see a white ship leave the last shore, the pale phantoms in her cold bosom like gulls wailing? And it's this beautiful poem. He goes on and talks about this last white ship leaving the shores, and describing all of the moon and the moon falling, a corpse candle, the storm mumbling, the abyss moving, and he goes on. It's a really pretty poem.
Yeah.
And he gives a couple others. The reason he gives a couple other examples is because he's written them in different meters. So not only does he have these languages, but they are in different poetic styles, different structures. So not only does he have the poetry in another language, but he has examples of different poems that he's written to fit different meters. So he's gone so far into this, and he gives examples of these and things like that, and they're very pretty. But he says, by way of epilogue, is at the bottom 217, I may say that such fragments, nor even a constructed whole, do not satisfy all the instincts that go to make poetry. It is no part of this paper to plead that such inventions do so, but that they abstract certain of the pleasures of poetic composition and sharpen them by making them more conscious. Is an attenuated emotion, but may be very piercing, this construction of sounds to give pleasure. So that's really what he's talking about here.
Yes.
It's this very piercing, very strange, but somehow very beautiful hobby that he has that's purely, aesthetic. You can't really share this with anyone else because nobody else speaks this language. It's just in the sound itself for other people that would interest them. But of course, now we have so many people and so many books like on the languages that he made, treating them like they are real languages,
Right.
look at the grammar and things like that. So people have gone very far.
Yes.
But yeah, he goes on and he talks in this, he talks about the word music, this authentic magic of the poet. He says, in a living language, this is all the more poignant because the language is not constructed to do this, and only by rare felicity will it say what we wish it to, significantly, and at the same time sing carelessly. I thought that was a really good description of just what poetry is in general, right? Because language, we don't talk in poetry, and so it's a really concerted effort to make it, not only get the meaning you want to come across, but make it, what he says, sing carelessly.
Yes.
Right. It has to be beautiful as well as giving the meaning of the poem that you want it to have.
Yes.
Yeah, so that was a neat description there.
Yeah, agreed. What is I don't know, maybe you have other things to say, but he has the last paragraph, and I'm a little. I want to get your input on what he meant by this. So he says, language has both strengthened imagination and been freed by it. Who shall say whether the free adjective has created images bizarre and beautiful, or the adjective been freed by strange and beautiful pictures in the mind? So what does he mean by
he's
that?
talking, I think it's important to also read the paragraph before that. He says, but nonetheless, as soon as you have fixed even a vague general sense for your words, many of the less subtle but most moving and permanently important of the strokes of poetry are open to you, for you are the heir of the ages. You have not to grope after the dazzling brilliance of invention of the free adjective to which all human language has not yet fully attained. You may say green sun or dead life and set the imagination leaping. So he's saying we're lucky because, we don't have to create our own languages to make poetry. We're the heir to the ages. We have all of these words that have been passed down to us by the people who've come before, and I can use them however I want. Right, I can use the word green, which does not describe the sun. The sun is not green, but I can make poetry about the green sun. I can write a story about the green sun. He says, if that's language, maybe helping our imagination work, because we have the word for green, we have the word for sun, and that gives us the ability to imagine the green sun. Or maybe we have the idea of the green sun, and that enables us to free the adjective. It's like a chicken or the egg problem he's kind of describing here at the end. But either way, he's saying we're so lucky that we live like in a language that's been passed down to us, and we can use it in such a way that we can write poetry. We don't have to make our own languages. We don't have to do what Tolkien did and just start from scratch to make something beautiful. We can use the words that we have and make poetry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's like the counter argument for what he's doing.
It's essentially.
No, because I could. Thank you for that explanation.
And that's going back.
Befuddled by it.
And that's going back to his point on fairy stories, where he talks about the power of like language and adjectives when you're making a fairy story. I think he even uses the example of the green sun, like in his in that essay as well, where it's like we can describe things that aren't actually existing. That's the power of language to do that.
I guess, at some fundamental level, it's probably one of those things that really separates us from the other animals.
Oh yeah,
because they have animals can communicate, as we know, with our even with our dogs. If they want something from me, they grunt at me, or they can pout. They can communicate things, but they don't have the language, and that's what you've described him describing, because it didn't quite make sense to me. But being able to use the existing language for like those concepts and create different concepts that didn't exist before you use that as kind of a foundation. Right. I think that really is a good explanation of how human knowledge and creativity and science is developed.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think you could take from on fairy stories he talks about earlier. Yeah. So like humans are the one thing that can talk about things that aren't like immediately present.
Yes.
Right. It's like we can not just like the fictional world, but we can also talk about like love or like beauty and things like that. Where it's like we don't see beauty, we see things that are beautiful, but we know what beauty is.
Yes.
And that's done through language. It's like other animals can communicate, but no other animal will talk about what love is or what beauty is. Like, it's just impossible. They don't have that capability.
Right.
But yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Good discussion.
I'm glad you enjoyed that. We have only one more, and I guess
Yes.
we should say what we're doing for next season, because we actually decided ahead of time. And that is, what was your pick, right?
Yes.
Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. Yes.
Yeah, because we're both involved in higher education, and I thought that
that is true.
Yes, I still have to complete my curriculum.
There you go.
The new class that I'm creating from scratch. It starts in a couple of weeks. I better get moving because I have to create the entire curriculum and the quizzes and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
I'll get working on that this week. Criminal law. There you go. So I know I've forgotten more than most people know about criminal law in Missouri. So I'm not anticipating a whole lot of difficulty. It's just putting it in a structure where it's beneficial to the students.
Right.
But so I have that interest, and then because I think the Closing American Mind has a lot to do with higher education system, and and so it's something that I've always wanted to read, haven't got around to it, and so hopefully it'll tee us off for some interesting discussions.
I think so. Well, the
last one is what? His
valedictory address at the University of Oxford, which is really interesting because usually when you're elected to like the chair of a department, you give a speech. And Tolkien, I forget for whatever reason, never did. And so he kind of treats his leaving speech, this is like essentially his retirement speech. He's given a valedictory address to a graduating class as he's leaving. So he kind of uses that like almost as an introductory speech in a way. And he talks about the relationship with like language and literature and things like that. It's a really good essay. So
and enjoy that one. I will say this, even though some of it the topic was not really that much of an interest to me as far as the technical language stuff.
Sure.
But I think if I were in the audience, even without the interest, I think it would have been a really fascinating talk.
For sure. I think you'd say it the same for all of these.
Yes.
And they're just all so well written. He has such interesting phrases. Like he put so much effort into these essays.
Yes.
Where it's like you really don't need to. You could say it much simpler. But I think even a lot of these essays count as poetry in some parts.
And
how he writes.
I wonder if he was so talented. I wonder if this is how he had conversations. Like some people just speak in prose.
Right.
Is that right? Did I say that? Poetry.
Speak in poetry. Prose is the opposite.
Prose is the opposite. Yes. I don't even speak in prose. I'm grunts and whistles and clicks and stuff. So I mean, maybe I'm sure there's a lot of that, but obviously he really worked on these too, because it really is pretty.
Yeah. And we do have descriptions of like people who attended his lectures and stuff, because it's kind of easy to forget that he was like an actual professor.
Yes,
he wasn't just an author.
Yeah.
But they're like, it's kind of interesting because evidently he was really hard to understand sometimes. Like he would kind of mumble. You could tell that he was so passionate about everything that if you could hear him, right, you'd have to sit in the first few rows so you could hear him.
Yeah.
But if you did hear him, like you were just so much better off for it, because he was just such a great lecturer and was so passionate about everything he talked about.
Well, that's all my students say about me.
No, I'm sure. That's why they all sit in the back.
They do not. There's only so many seats. It's a small classroom. I think I'm full.
Yeah, I'm really. There you go. All right. Well, do you have any other closing thoughts for this episode?
No.
All right. Well, this has been Season 11, Episode 7 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.